Thank you, Steve, and thank you. What an amazing standing room only session. This is really exciting so early in the morning. I'm Gretchen Libby. I'm the Director of Visual Computing at AWS. I joined about 2.5 years ago from Industrial Light and Magic, where I spent my career making visual effects for movies and television. We are here today to talk about generative AI in the media and entertainment industry. And there's a lot of questions today and in the future about the role of AI in our industry. Like any tool, generative AI needs to be used responsibly, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. And we're eager to see how the entertainment industry proceeds with defining the use cases and what the acceptable use cases will be. At AWS, we are committed to responsible use of AI. And we will get into a little bit of that today, and I look forward to talking with our esteemed panelists. To my right, Ravgender Arni from AWS, John Footen from Deloitte, and Garrett Goodman from PaperCup. So let's dive in. Arni, thanks. Can you give us a little bit of the history of generative AI as well as AI/ML, and like how we arrived at where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Really happy to be here, and welcome to IBC. So I lead a team called the Customer Acceleration Team within AWS, so we do a ton of very advanced prototypes across a range of industries, financial services, telco, and media. As I look at, I've been in the space of technology and AI for a very long time. I think since the early days of computing, roughly 50s, to the early 2000s, there was more AI in the movies than in actual use. But since the early 2000s, AI took off by a lot. But most of the use of AI has been more focused on predicting stuff. So it was now broadly called as predictive AI. Could be fraud, right? Trying to understand what's happening. Recognition, is that a dog or a cat on the internet, right? So that was mostly what AI was used for. The big change that has happened over the last couple of years, and most certainly this year, is not a replacement of AI, but in addition to AI, which is we're moving from not just predicting things, but generating things as well. So for example, we've done a lot of engagements in financial services, helping wealth managers, like if you're sitting down with a customer, rather than do a lot of research by hand, they look at all the data about the customer, produce a briefing document, so as a wealth manager, you can have a more meaningful conversation with that customer. We work in healthcare, where we're using generative AI to produce new class of drugs, because at the end of the day, DNA and proteins are just information. So AI has come a really long way. It's gone through a tough time, I'd say from the 50s to 2000, but the last 10 years, and I expect the next 20 to 40 years, will be very dominated by the field of AI.
Excellent, well thank you. John, you've been in the media and entertainment industry for a long time. Can you tell us your perspective on where we are today?
Sure. So I've been in media and entertainment since I was a teenager, actually. I started off on the creative side in production and post-production, but then moved into technology in my 20s and have been involved in the technology side of the industry ever since. So I've seen a number of different industry changes from videotape and film to computer-based systems, et cetera. This is, we are about to enter another, I guess, generation phase shift in terms of the way that we approach doing things in the industry. At each of these changes that we've done historically, there has been a change in the nature of the work. I will point out that I don't think that we've reduced the number of human beings, so the fears about job losses are probably overblown, but what we do with those human beings has changed over time. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the challenges that we will be facing with AI. But I'm very optimistic in where we're headed with this. AI has applicability in pre-production, production, post-production, and in distribution. And I definitely want to, at some point here, talk about the use of generative AI in distribution. So yeah, there's plenty to be excited about, and not as much to be feared as some might think.
Well, we have a kind of short time here. Maybe you should jump on your distribution commentary quickly here.
Oh, sure.
Please.
So one of the things I don't think a lot of people think about in terms of generative AI is how generative AI can be used to create the content that is distributed. So for example, personalizing the content for each viewer in some way is something that I think will be of dramatic importance in the future. I think particularly of how generative AI can interact with things like live sports and even with news. And there are some ethical questions that come up with some of these things, but it is possible to imagine that one of the roles of generative AI is to effectively create an avatar for yourself that is a kind of curator for you. So when I want to see content, I can effectively ask my generative AI, who knows a lot about me, including my mood at the moment, maybe who's in the room with me,
Wow.
things like that. What content should be generated for me right now that would match that? So I think that's a distribution function, effectively, because we're talking about real content and mixing it with generated content. But there's a lot of exciting possibilities in that, and perhaps if the costs come down, that's even more near term than the ability of generative AI to do truly creative tasks. So anyway.
Excellent, thank you. Garrett, on to you. There's a mad dash to get into this business of generative AI and PaperCup. We'd love to hear the story of, as a startup and how the business has evolved, and tell us what you're up to.
Sure, so it's amazing to see such a full room. Thank you all for coming. I'm Garrett Goodman, VP Sales at PaperCup. I started my career in the New York Times in the syndication department, so I've always been on the business side of content. PaperCup itself started 5 years ago. It was born out of Cambridge University, an academic project around speech synthesis. So we do AI dubbing. We had this breakthrough 5 years ago in bringing emotional depth to these synthetic voices. And fast forward to today, we serve the media. We have companies like Bloomberg, like Cineverse, Fremantle, Fuse, using us in primarily one of two ways, either fitting into their streaming strategies or to their social media strategies. So when it comes to where these companies are applying our generative AI, it is more on the distribution side and bringing their content to their audience in their own language so it can engage them more deeply.
Excellent.
Yeah, actually, just to give an example, in addition to all that we can do with the voice or the text or the graphics, if you imagine, for example, somebody in this room loves horror movies but hates blood, generative AI could generate a version of the horror movie on the fly that takes into account that preference and only gets rid of the blood.
I can't wait. That's a really interesting proposition. Arnie, we talked earlier about responsible use, but people have a lot of questions about Gen AI and some of the challenges, how to not end up in the New York Times, so to speak, on the front page. Can you talk a little bit about how we are going to manage this going forward, and additionally maybe some of the legal implications?
Yeah, I had a funny customer anecdote. Usually we walk into customers, the first question they ask is like, hey, how do we make sure this thing does not hallucinate? Because these large language models that power generative AI are statistical machines that tend to make things up. And this customer came explicitly to us, say, I want to make sure it hallucinates a lot, because they're a creative company, right? So they are less factual, they want more creativity. So over the last 9 months that we've been deeply engaged with customers, there's a few patterns and tricks we've seen. Number one is almost every language model has a setting and a parameter called temperature. And the temperature, it varies by the model from 0 to 1 or 0 to 2. The higher the setting and the temperature, the more it can hallucinate. You want it to be more creative in its output. So depending on the kind of use case that you want, you can go from be very factual to be as creative as possible, right? That's kind of pattern number one. The second one is using prompt engineering. The LLMs are, again, statistical machines, but they react and respond really well to human input. So if you've heard the word prompt engineering before, it's a technique by which you can really speak to these machines in a very unique way. The last 6 months, there's been people like, if you've seen jobs for prompt engineering, it takes a special style and skill to learn how to speak to them, but the machines, the algorithms have gotten easier and easier. But using smart prompt engineering, you can again reduce hallucinations by a second. The third is, again, an engineering technique now called RAG. It's a way by which you retrieve data from your data sources, you then mash that up with your model, and then you use that to generate the information, so retrieval augmented generation. And you combine the temperature, the prompt engineering, and RAG to dramatically reduce the amount of hallucination it can do. So we have customers that can essentially sit down, and either it's a chatbot or embedded in an application where you're like, hey, do I want a factual answer, or do I want to be creative, or do I want to be somewhere in the middle? You can use these different things to like control how accurate you want it to be, and as a result, be off the front page in the New York Times, right? So that's one big part of it.
One thing I can add to that is the source data from which your model is trained is an important factor in what the output will be, right? So oftentimes people are thinking about the current large language models that are using a large portion of the internet as a training ground. You can train models on smaller data sets, in which case you will get potentially more reliable, predictable results. You also can avoid some of the challenges that we will face with this in terms of the legal questions, the IP rights, and things like that. So this same technology that is, the ChatGPT example of, working across so much data, that same technology can be applied to smaller data sets that are just part of your organization, for which you do have the IP that's already cleared, and can still generate interesting results for which you don't have as much to worry about from a legal or regulatory perspective.
Yeah, and there's been a big push, just like how when you buy a can of soup and you look at the back, you know what goes into it. There's been a new thrust in the industry around model cards, right? So any model you pick, you look in the back and say what data went into it, what algorithms were used to create it, because you really want to understand the data that has gone in the creation of the model, because that data has a big role to play in what comes out, right? That's one part of it. The bigger question, or maybe equally important question is, all right, once you've created the data, who owns the copyright for that?
Yes.
Is it the algorithm maker? Is it the human that created it? Or is it someone else altogether? So this is being actively discussed. There's been a huge discussion last week. So a couple of senators in the US, the EU themselves, of course, here, have had a set of strong opinions, and law is still being written on this. But as of right now, it clearly states that anything that's produced, right, you cannot copyright something that's only produced by a machine. You need to have a human input that you can assign a human to, right, when you do copyright. But that is going to change, I believe, in the next couple of years as people start to grapple with the sheer amount of AI-generated content and humans paying a greater premium on human-generated content, right? So that is going to, I think, reshape how we produce and consume content.
Yeah,
Agreed.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Garrett.
just to jump in with a concrete example on training on smaller data sets as opposed to scraping enormous data sets that are maybe more generalized. This has been our approach at PaperCup, is to actually work specifically with voice actors and to train on very high fidelity sets of data from real professionals in the field in order to get a higher quality output. So it's a very specialized text-to-speech engine that we've built specifically to create voices for video and for those types of performances that you need in order to really engage with an audience beyond a 5-second utterance that we might hear from a phone assistant, for example.
Yeah, there's actually, and I think we talked about it before the session a little bit, there's actually, in my opinion, a future trend where small data set based models are going to prevail because they will be very more predictable in terms of their behavior in a given use case. And then the other thing I think we'll see more in the future is more than one AI working together. An AI that has, for example, you were talking about it from a driving perspective, and maybe you can talk about that example a little bit, but two AIs that work together to create a result that's more predictable.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of our customers start to be very particular. Like the last 6 months has been focused on one model to rule it all. And AWS's strategy, and broadly what we're seeing from our customers is using bespoke models for solving discrete tasks. And as a result, you essentially have a way by which you can say, I'm going to use model A to perform task A, which is maybe text summarization, model B for image generation, model C for video generation. And as a part of the creative process, you want to stitch all that together, right? So rather than take one large model that's consumed everything, which may land you in a copyright hell, is you pick smaller bespoke models and then you stitch that together. So with that, you combine human ingenuity, plus you take away the mundane stuff that needs to happen when you're creating content. And using AI to help you take away the mundane part, but still using humans to do the creative part. I think that's really where our customers and broadly the industry is seeing the most value.
Can I bring up a challenge that what you just described brings for this industry? So this industry forever has been based on the idea that there's effectively an apprenticeship model from which people rise in their careers. One of the things that you do in your early stage of the career tends to be to work on more of the 80% of content that is not so original, creative. You get started somewhere, right? And then you build up to the point where you then start to do the higher end, the better stuff. Well, one of the things that we're going to see is that these technologies are going to be capable of doing what that early job is, not necessarily the later jobs. So there's going to be, I think, new career paths that will have to be followed by people as they go into the industry. We still need those folks, but they're not going to have those starting points in their career as they exist today. There's going to be new places, maybe longer apprenticeships, maybe actually longer times in university or whatever as time goes on, because the entry point of where the human becomes valuable is at a later stage.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about this in the media and entertainment space where, for example, an art department PA, production assistant who pulls together an initial array of photographs, reference photographs, might now, be able to do that, up in a heartbeat. You've seen some transitions over time, all of you, from new tools and technology. Can you speak to, Arnie, some of the things that we're about to face as we transition here in terms of, well, John kind of just referenced it, but advancements in tools and how that will affect us?
Well, I think even before we get to the tool, the real issue is data, right? I mean, AI cannot live without data. Data is the oil that really pushes AI forward. If nothing else, I think this recent push in AI has put a spotlight on better data management, better data governance for a lot of our customers. They're trying to think and say, hey, look, I don't want to consume all of this data in its raw form, because if I can curate my data just a little bit better, I can drive better outcomes with applying these models, which is even more important because the tech that's needed to run generative AI is extremely expensive. GPUs, which is the main compute layer, and everything that surrounds it, the networking that goes with it, the memory banks that go with it, the connectivity between the memory and those GPUs, they're very, very, very expensive. To build one of these models, no one go about building one, a full-blown model runs $20 to $30 million, right? Just the sheer compute costs are so high. So for a lot of our customers, they're trying to think through and say, look, if I'm going to spend even a fraction of that money, and I want to drive the right ROI coming out of it, because that's really what this is all about. What's the business value? We're not doing tech for just tech's sake. The biggest shift is think about your data strategy. Think about where your data comes from, not just the copyright aspects and all that, the legal aspects, that's obviously a given, but how do you store it, how do you massage it, how do you curate it? Because without understanding that, the full outcome you'll get out of the models will not be that good.
One thing I could say is I'm sure 100% of the audience in here will agree that predicting the future is impossible with any precision at all. And we, no matter which way the Gen AI thing goes, there's all kinds of possible futures with Gen AI. What you just said is really important. Whether it's Gen AI or not, a good flexible infrastructure layer and a comprehensive and accurate data layer in even your current technologies that you're using today before we even get to AI is going to be valuable. AI requires it. But even today, without AI, doing those tasks in your organizations where you get that data right, you get that infrastructure right, is going to be useful no matter what.
Garrett, I'm curious, following on that, how is PaperCup structured, do you have new roles that are responsible for the AI alone, or?
Yeah, we have a core research team, so we're proper ML company. So about half of the company are machine learning engineers, PhDs in artificial intelligence. We're building these models ourselves.
Right.
So it's really crucial for us because we are building these specialized text-to-speech engines to be on top of the entire flow from how we source the data, deciding which scripts we give to a specific voice actor, doing a casting with a bunch of voice actors to find the right fill, all the way through to figuring out how do we deploy them, how do we build the control mechanisms within our platform to allow our translators to be able to manipulate and finesse the delivery of the voices. And so this is something that we do, which is not that common in the AI dubbing and synthetic speech space, is we actually do have a human in the loop, right? So every video that comes through our platform is worked on by a professional translator who's a native speaker of the target language. And they're going in, they're adjusting for the accuracy of the translation. They're doing a little bit of that art where the human input is so valuable, that art of paraphrasing, to make sure that what you hear actually matches what you see, because a machine translation as a first pass is not going to get that context and is not necessarily going to deliver a high quality output. And the translators are also working on the delivery of the voices and figuring out where should we punch up the emotion, where should we elongate a pause, where should we make it sound more like a question. So I think that human input is crucial to have a really high quality output. And so a lot of our growth right now is around building out on the ML side and also on the languaging side of it.
Excellent. We have just a few minutes left. I'd love to hear from each of you some advice on how people can get started in AI ML, or using generative AI, sorry.
I'm slightly biased from AWS, so you'll hear the AWS side of it, of course. So if you're an existing AWS user, there's quite a few ways you can get going. Number one is a solution that we built called Bedrock. It's the easiest way to get started with Gen AI. Included in it, it aligns with the strategy I spoke about. You have 8 to 9 different models, broadly called foundation models, and hence the word Bedrock. Some of them are text to text. So we can take large amounts of text, you can summarize it. You can take short amount of text and generate a lot of conversation. You can have the models reason, do Q&A, build chatbots. We also have models broadly called multimodal models. So you can take a text and produce an image. You can take an image and dramatically alter the image. These are the broader diffuser style models, from stable diffusion and these kind of things. So that's one class of solutions. The second one, which goes one level deeper, for those customers that want to extremely get hands-on, fine-tune the models a lot more, you have a lot of data that you want to take in and customize those models. SageMaker, which is a long-running and very well-known solution within the AWS ecosystem, has now been extended to support a lot of those models. So now you can fine-tune and take a series of, there's roughly 13,000 open source models in the generative AI space. A subset of those are available in the AWS ecosystem, so you can get going there. And the last one is data. As I mentioned, you cannot not do data. So AWS has long been about data management, data governance, Redshift, the whole ecosystem around big data. So you essentially suck in data from those data assets, use Bedrock and SageMaker to build those. And the last one is work with teams like mine. I have software engineers, UX people, data scientists. We come in, spend 3 to 6 weeks with you, take your business problem in a very short amount of time, build a solution that hopefully solves a problem and drives an outcome for you, right? That's one way you can get started with us really quickly.
Thank you, Arnie. We have like 13 seconds left.
Okay, I'll be quick. Do what he said in terms of the your data layer. You can work now on the core things that will enable AI to be successful, but then I'll go back to something you also said earlier, which is that this is all about the business. So develop a vision around AI, My highest recommendation to you is that you be transparent with your employees and your colleagues about what the view of AI is and what your plans are, and then get started in that proof of concept domain with regards to whatever it is that you're doing.
Excellent.
So for anyone involved in localization, it's never been easier to find an AI dubbing company that does this. The barriers to entry are really, really low. So I would just caution everybody to choose the right balance of quality and scale, because there are a lot of partners that can do incredible scale, but a little bit of a human touch goes a long way for the quality of the output.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Arnie, John, Garrett. Thanks all of you for attending, and have a wonderful rest of IBC.